Hello, Iris J here with Madrona's Pulse Teachings, Astrology for Healing, and I hope that this video finds you doing well whenever it is you're watching it, wherever you are in the globe. I'm going to chat with you today about the houses in the Zodiac. This has a couple applications. One is when you're just trying to understand your natal chart as this tool for self-inquiry. The houses are really important. And as I'm building content for supporting folks doing exactly that, self-inquiry through astrology, this will help you understand how to work with the energies of each house. It's also really important for understanding transits. And since I'm often saying in my transit videos, so you want to see where this is happening and what house it's in, I thought, why not first have a video there so that folks can go and hear about the houses. And also this is here so that if you want to just kind of check in. And I feel like with astrology, there's so many layers that we can never hear about the archetypes too many times. We can never, it doesn't matter if we're a beginner or advanced, we can never just check in with the archetypes of the houses, of the signs. There's always little bits that we hear that we come to in a new light because we're ready to come to it in a new light, or we're focusing on something a little bit different at that point in our life. So I'm going to go through the houses and you can just listen and think about how the energies speak with you. So then when you're, it also, I should say, when you're talking and looking at your natal chart, if you don't have any planets in a certain house, like if you just have an empty second house, that's totally fine. Okay. It doesn't mean that that house has no importance for you at all. Like if you have an empty seventh house, it doesn't mean that you're never going to have one-on-one relationships. Astrology is not literal like that. There's all different layers of the way that the energies of archetypes, such as relational archetypes, speak through the chart. That's what a astrology natal reading is really important for. That said, if you have an empty second house or you have an empty seventh house, when planets are transiting through there, that does become a time when that energy is activated, and that's going to stir things up in your psyche or your life. And that's part of how we work with astrology. So as you're learning your own chart, if you have a ton of planets sitting there in your fifth house, then that is an indicator that that fifth house is a place where there's a lot of energy and a lot of attention in this life. Again, there's always more layers, but just keeping that in mind as you're thinking about the houses and as you're learning about your own chart, working with the transits. So we go through the Zodiac. We start with the first house and we go all the way around to the 12th house. And one of the things that we see in astrology is that, it's not as though the first house happens and then the second house comes and we just leave everything behind. The second house is expanding upon the energy of the first house, and it's bringing in new elements. The third house is expanding upon the energy of the second house that was expanding upon the first. It's a continual threads. It's a continual weaving. Astrology does not work in clear-cut binaries by any means. So when we're talking about the 12th house, the final house of the Zodiac, part of the reason that the 12th house is a very deep, complex energy is because it's coming at the very end of the journey. Sometimes you hear people talk about the 12th house as if it's kind of pregnant with all the energy that comes before. That's a complex situation to be in within this human psyche journey that we're in. So there's a lot of layers, okay? And part of it is just learning, however, that the energetic archetypes of each house. So that is what I'm going to do now with Athena, who's here. So the first house of the Zodiac, the first house is all about identity. It's all about this question, who am I? Who am I here to show to the world? The first house begins with that ascendant or rising sign that starts on the eastern horizon when we're born, that's what the rising sign signifies, and that begins the first house. It is very possible as we go through these houses that you have, it depends upon the house system that you use. You could have only one sign occupying a house. You could have two. At some points, you could even have three. All of those energies are speaking to the archetype of the house that I'm going to open up. So that first house starts with your rising sign, and then what other energies are in there. This is the house of identity, who I am. And, you know, this is never a question that's just going to be answered. It's going to shift through different stages of our life. It's going to shift through as we enter into different layers of the archetypes of the planets and the sign that we have speaking with our first house, as we have different transits. But it's really asking us about our identity. And it's asking us about our identity in a way that is not really concerned with other people. Other people are involved, and other people can act as mirrors, and they can trigger things in us that help us shine out certain ways or help us go into oppressed, shadowy areas of our identity that we're then going to work with and bring to the surface, hopefully in a reclaiming, sacred way. But this first house is really asking about who I am. It's also the house of the identity's impulses, whether that is the impulses of I'm hungry and I need to eat, or, you know, the impulses of these deep soul feelings that we have within the body, but they're energies that are coming up to be discovered in terms of who I am. What am I here to do? How am I here to show this to the world in terms of how I conceptualize my sense of self? Not what I've been told I am supposed to be. Not what society and or family and the combination of them or partners expect me to be. Part of the journey of the first house is figuring out who I am for my soul to be here to accomplish what it's here to do. Okay, and that's part of what the rising sign is all about as well. Second house, this is developing. We've had this first house journey of who am I, and then we move into the second house, which is working with my values, which is working with my values so that they extend outwards into the foundations of the life that I'm building for myself. The second house is still very much about my sense of identity, creating foundations that support me to go journey through this life. Absolutely, those foundations are going to involve other people. The second house wants to involve people who share values with us. A big part of the second house is figuring out our journey, and therefore a big part of figuring out our values, and therefore a big part of the second house journey is the journey of discovering my values. And this sounds simple sometimes, but it's really not. Sometimes it can take decades to separate and find the security within ourselves to separate our values from the values that we were taught to embody, especially as children, especially in the type of culture that we're raised in terms of our parents' values, in terms of our own cultural backgrounds, in terms of society, depending upon our age, in terms of what social media has taught us, especially if you're younger watching this and you grew up with social media. What values were you taught about what it means to be successful, what it means to have your gender, what it means to be a human being here? And are they your values, or are they things that you've been socialized into believing? The second house is complicated in that respect. It also includes our finances. And again, the idea is that it wants the energy, the archetypal energy of that second house wants to work with finances and income as extensions of our values. And so that can also be part of the second house journey. It's also, you know, the way that our own psyche is a resource, our emotions are a resource that we're going to use to build our life upon. That again, our relationships are resources that are absolutely going to be part of the foundations in our life. So it's all of the resources that we use to build the foundations for our life. That was my dog. I'm sorry. Third house third house brings us into a couple layers of meaning. So on the one hand, the third house is small community. The small communities that become part of our daily life, we could say. You know, if you're a parent and you have kids and you drop them off, or you go to kids groups, or if you live in a small town, it's kind of that small community. If you're in a big city, but then there's ways that you access your daily life in the big city through the small communities that form within a city. It's all of those small communities. It's also the house of communication. It's the house of how we discover more about ourselves through our voice and the way that we use that voice in small community, in our relationships. It's absolutely a house that is aligned with throat chakra themes of life and development and reclaiming. The way that communication becomes a root of self-discovery is part of this third house archetype. It's also the house of siblings, which is very strong for some folks and not strong for others. If you have a ton of planets or placements in this house, or you have a huge transit, that can bring up layers of the way that our siblings are part of our soul journey and us discovering, for better or worse sometimes, part of us kind of doing the work that our soul is here to do. But that again is only working with some folks in this house. But absolutely, it's also, you know, the third house can also, it can be our daily habits of mind, our daily thoughts, the way that we talk to ourselves internally. That can show up in the third house because it's part of the house of how we think and how we communicate. And so especially if we come from certain traumatic backgrounds, or we've been taught very negative things about ourselves at the intersection of so many social identities, sometimes there's relearning that has to happen in that third house, and that can be pointed to by the chart in terms of our inner dialogue, because that inner dialogue is a mechanism of how we think, and therefore how we communicate to the world in those small communities, but also how we communicate to ourselves. Fourth house. The fourth house is a house that is dealing with quite a lot. Okay, so we've, you know, we're in this journey through the first few houses of discovering a self, literally the self-identity in that first house. And then we start coming in and we're building our foundation so that we can then extend into community, and we can start communicating these values that we've been discovering. In the fourth house, we reach the root of the chart. Literally, it anchors the chart. It's the root. It's also the root of the psyche. It's the root chakra. It is a very significant house. If you have planets in that fourth house, then those are going to be ways that you work with this. If you don't have planets in the fourth house, it still is a significant house, and there's other layers through which that house is speaking in your chart. But it's how we enter our own sense of self, first and foremost. How we become and feel safe within our sense of self. Okay, and this is a fluid sense of self. This is, even if you have a solid earth sign, if you have Taurus in your, if you've got that fixed, if you have Taurus energy in your fourth house, it's still a fluid sense of self, and transits are going to be really important to that fixed energy, your fourth house, because this is the psyche. And the archetype of this house is aligned with Cancer. So it's that fluid womb energy. It's where we're discovering our own sense of self in our psyche in this life, that is also rooted to our ancestral lineages, both of bloodlines in our family in this life, and also of our soul ancestry. So there's a lot of intersecting, complicated layers in this house. There's quite a bit of karmic imprinting that can come up in this house, especially if you do have some kind of karmic planet signatures such as Pluto or Saturn. It just means that that's going to be a theme then. Probably also healing those lineages is going to be a theme in this life. And in that respect, it's this place where we come into our sense of self, into the psyche, into the rootedness of ourself, and therefore it also includes our home and our family, both the family we're born into and our chosen family, which can sometimes differ from that family that we're born into. It can overlap. Family despite what normative media teaches about its representation of the perfect, happy nuclear family, is a very fluid concept, is a very fluid embodiment. The way that our relational dynamics with our birth family change, the way that there can be trauma around that, the way that we mature and find chosen family, the way that our birth family can weave in a new dimension once we're mature. It is a very fluid, shifting concept, okay? That doesn't get emphasized enough because it's directly related to the psyche of the individual who embodies this chart, because it's about the way that our rootedness in this human journey is shifting. There's a lot of layers to the fourth house. It's also the house, you know, how we become at home. And ultimately, the journey of the fourth house is how we become safe within ourselves, safe within our own psyche. And sometimes that requires quite a bit of ancestral work, of healing, of learning, of unlearning. All the journeys that we're on, those are fourth house journeys. Fifth house. Fifth house is where this, you know, psyche that was developing in the fourth house gets to begin shining out in creative expressions to the world. The fifth house is the house of creative self-actualization, where I am actually moving on from kind of exploring the inner depths of my psyche, which is in my rootedness in this experience of my human journey, which is the fourth house, into I am feeling this creative divine energy flowing through me, and I want to play with that and create with that, and I want to use that and bring that out into the world, whatever that means. A lot of times we say the word creativity and we think immediately of visual art or artistic endeavors. It is that. The house includes that. But I mean, getting dressed is a creative act. How we make our breakfast is a creative act. We are creative beings to the core. And the fifth house is the way that we live as creative beings in our everyday life as well. That's part of this. It's also that playful energy that comes in self-actualization, and therefore also includes children. It's a house where themes of children can show up. There's so many different ways that we work with and live with the energy of children. It's not just children that we give birth to. So there's a lot of layers, but it can include that as well. But it's really about where that sense of self is actualizing, and that can happen through having children. It can happen through creative projects. It can happen through the way that we hold ourselves and engage in the world. It's about the energy of wanting to engage with this sense of self that I'm developing. It's very much this sense of self that's going out into the world. The sixth house, we move from that creative self into some of embodiment in our daily life. Okay, the sixth house is all about our daily habits and our embodiment of that creative energy coming together and realizing that I have a mind and a body and they have to work in sync with each other. It is a house of ultimately how working in sync with body and mind every day, somewhat in a devotional manner, ideally, becomes a practice of quite literally sanctifying this human experience. The sixth house is a house of also service. And in that's kind of what the idea of the sanctifying is, that I know that the way I live my life, the way that I treat my own body, the way that I treat my mind, this is still a focus on the self, because we're still developing a sense of self in the sixth house. That how I live every single day of my life is a big part of that, and that I can live in a somewhat devotional way, which could mean that I find practices to help support my mind-body health and my mind-body connection. For some people, that could be a daily meditation practice. Meditation, however, doesn't have to look like me in the classic kind of meditative pose. It could be walking in the woods. It could be reading poetry every morning. It could be the practice of coffee with a newspaper. It could be going for a jog, a walk in the woods with the dog. However, and the energy of our sixth house by element and sign and then planets is going to help us understand a little bit more of the types of daily practices we need to really support us. But it's a house that's ultimately about the mind-body connection coming together and creating the systems by which we support ourselves. This is why it also, like if you're wanting to look at the chart for indicators of the type of work that we want to do in this life, the sixth house is part of that because it's our daily habits, because it's our daily way of living. And ultimately, we want to find a work that aligns with the energy of sixth house, because most of us participate in work daily. Not all of us, though. So for some people, it's different. And also being of service. And it can really bridge, we want the bridge of what's of service to my own being, and then also bridging out what's of service to the world, what's of service to the environment, what's of service to the collective, what is sustainable both for my own sense of self, emotionally, psychologically, physically, spiritually, and also sustainable for the collective. This is just like it's the mind-body connection. There's a bit of that energy of, service for the collective coming through my own sense of self in the sixth house. Seventh house. So with the seventh house, we enter into a new phase of the zodiac. We started with the first and we've gone all the way through this bottom hemisphere, we could say. And this is really the developing sense of self. It's traditionally, we would say it's more of that introverted sense of self. I don't like to make just a binary claim like the bottom half is introverted and the top half is extroverted, because it depends upon the signs and it depends upon the planets, and the archetypes are always layering through. And sometimes people only have planets in the bottom half of their chart and they get taught that they have no function in the outer world, and that's just not real. That's not how the chart works. But traditionally, the archetypes of the houses are about discovering and evolving a very internal sense of self, because then we come into the seventh house and we go above the horizon and we're going to journey through the top half. And so the seventh house, what do you know? I've mostly been focusing on the sense of self and my own identity. I pop over that line and holy smokes, there's other people. It's the house of one-on-one relationships in the seventh house. This is where we start encountering another person. And again, it still is also about us. In the seventh house, the house of one-on-one relationships, we discover that there's aspects of ourself that we can only encounter and we can only learn about and we can only work on and transform by being in relationship. We can do all the therapy we can do all the therapy we want, right? And we can just be in ourselves and we can just have that like objective therapist who's giving us. The moment we go into one-on-one relationship, it gets messy, and all those wonderful constructs of psychoanalytical theory, like they're not always as clear, because there's certain aspects of embodied human identity that require relationship to be worked out. And I am not just talking about romantic partnership. I am talking about all one-on-one relationship, friendships. Yes, people that we enter into romantic partnerships with, teachers, colleagues, students, and or clients, just all the ways that one-on-one relationship shows up. And so the seventh house is where we start discovering what it means to be a relational being, what it means to, have been on this journey of self-discovery, and then realize that, well, we need things like compromise, and we need things, and that compromise is driven by love and compassion and trying to create the beauty and balance of that Libra archetype, which is aligned with the seventh house. So it's really about discovering other people, and also a way that other people mirror ourselves back to us. And this is why we require relationships in our life, because we are social beings, yes. And also because we're attracted to people that show us things about ourselves that we might not know, that show us things about ourselves that we might not have been taught it's okay to access. Like, think about some of the friends you're drawn to, or romantic partners or teachers that are living something, embodying something without shame. And that's part of the attraction. And part of that attraction is a soul attraction, so that we can learn that it's also okay to embody that within ourselves. And sometimes those journeys are like this, and then they separate because we've learned from each other, because we're usually showing them something too, always, right? The people that we partner up with are some of our greatest teachers in this life. And then our paths can diverge because our souls have learned what they're there to learn. And this then also invites past lives, and it invites the way that sometimes the 7th house is bringing one-on-one relationships that are absolutely about learning and picking up and transforming dynamics that may have come from past life relationships. And what a journey one-on-one relationships are. And that journey continues as we move into the 8th house. So the 8th house, like the 4th house, has a lot of layers to it. The 8th house, firstly, let's stick with continuing from that 7th house and that one-on-one journeying. The 8th house takes us into the house of intimacy. Okay, like if we really do want to look at marriage, or we want to look at long-term commitments and partnerships in the chart, the 7th house is part of it, but it's really the 8th house, because the 8th house is intimacy. The 8th house is the merging of my soul spirit psyche with another soul spirit psyche. The 8th house is ultimately a house of transformation. It is a house of death and rebirth. These are the archetypal energies of the 8th house, and that's why it includes so much. It includes the people that I merge with and I lose a sense of self with, and then I re-emerge and I've learned something. Think about who you were when you entered an intimate relationship, one that I think it's easiest to think about how it ended, and then think about who you were at different stages, and then also when you emerged out of that. We enter into these waters of intimacy, and we transform each other, and we have to let go of part of the sense of self that we've been developing in order to do that. By its very nature, the 8th house is murky. By its very nature, the 8th house is not really one that has boundaries in it, because it's about merging and transforming. In that respect, it's also the house that's about my own psyche's continual journey of transformation and death and rebirth. In this respect, it's the house that also has significance for our own mental health journeys. Also, if we want to work with others in mental health work, the 8th house usually shows up there. Because it's the house where we go into those depths. It's the house where we go into the murkiness. And it's really, really important when talking about the 8th house. There is absolutely no judgment about those depths. I actually don't really like to call the 8th house the house of the taboo. You may have heard this. Because what is considered taboo is, firstly, historically, it's considered taboo by people in power who live a very particular life, and traditionally in the West, we're upper class white men who are then projecting all sorts of power and power abuse into other people and creating this whole kind of, this is the taboo. So there's no judgment in the 8th house, because the 8th house is where we let go of those categories in order to explore ourselves and in order to transform, okay? But it does involve depths. It does involve sometimes emotional and or mental health struggles, because it's about the depth of the human experience, and it goes pretty freaking deep. Also, the house of death and rebirth and those themes come up in this house. And the occult. Also, the occult comes up, because the occult is going through the veil. And when we go through the veil, those boundaries are gone. So the occult also comes up in this house. 9th house. In the 9th house, we emerge transformed out of the 8th house depths. And we really enter onto these adventures and journeys of discovering our beliefs and our very inspired truths about the meaning of life, about the meaning of why we're here. You know, it's kind of like if you use that dark night of the soul analogy that many of us know, that's kind of the area of the 8th house. Like, we're just in it, we're in those depths, we are shedding things, and then we emerge, and it's after that that we usually have a narrative. That's when we write the book. We write the book after. What do you know? The 9th house is also the house of publishing, because it's where we make sense in a very intuitive, inspired way about our beliefs and our connection to culture, intercultural ways of connecting, intercultural ways of making meaning. In this tradition, this is why the 9th house is often just read as the house of higher education, the house of learning, the house of travel. It's those things, but not those things in and of themselves. It's those things because this is the house archetypally in which we are constructing meaning making for ourselves. And we are wanting to also share those ideas often with the world. So we might travel because we experience other cultures, or we're drawn to other cultures, also possibly because we have karmic connections coming up with those other cultures. We might experience that, and we experience different ways of making meaning and living and being, so that we can kind of create that mosaic for ourselves and understand the big questions. In that respect, it's the house of astrology, it's the house of philosophy, it's the house of any structure of meaning making. Okay. And when I say it's the house of astrology, sorry, I have to put this in because I think it's unfortunate. It's like, oh, astrology just shows up in the 9th house, or oh, astrology just shows up in the 11th house, or like, astrology shows up in every single house. We can talk about the way that astrology shows up in every single house. So if, like, you don't have to just have a 9th house placement in order for astrology to be important in your life. I just don't want to create any marginalizing beliefs with that. It's the house of astrology as a system of meaning making, just like it can be the house of religion if religion has been part of one's life, because religion ultimately is a system of meaning making. And it's very much about the personal truth being discovered through ways of making meaning. Okay, moving on to the 10th house. We're entering our final 3 now. The 10th house is where we've kind of, we've just been in the 9th house discovering our own belief systems and our own ways of making meaning that absolutely involve other cultures and systems of learning, sometimes institutions of learning. And then we enter into a new phase of the chart, which is where it's actually the last 3 houses are what we call the transpersonal quadrant of the chart. That's important because transpersonal means that we are going beyond the self. Okay, so the 10th house is actually where we take that kind of worldview that we've discovered and we cross into this very public part of the chart and or world, and it becomes about the role that we're going to play in the world. So when I say in the world, this doesn't have to mean that we're like a huge person, a huge persona. It's not about being famous. It's the world could be a tiny community of 800 people, okay? But even so, there's a connection between our individual self and the role that we're playing. And even if we only ever talk to 5 people in our life, all of our relational ways of being ripple out, and our role in the world is still significant. So it's where we have that role in the world. That's why it's traditionally thought of as the house of career. It's the house of vocation. It's the house of work that we want to do in terms of that worldview that we've constructed, that sense of self that's been transformed and created this way of understanding, contributing that to the world. But it's actually not really about our sense of self. So that's why when people really just like to look at celebrities' charts, the pop culture media scholar in me wants to go right in there and say why that's problematic, but I will not. What I will say is that celebrity culture in like 10th house is actually not, it's not a great example, because most celebrities are very much concerned about their own ego and their own identity, and the archetypal energy of the 10th house is about the role for the collective. It's heading towards the collective. It still is about the self, but not in an egotistical manner, not in a let me put my name on my corporation and my charity so that everyone can think about me. It's about the worldview that I've constructed going out into the world and playing a role, the work that I want to do to embody this incredible journey that I've been in through the Zodiac to go out into the world. Okay. And in that, and also our vocation, I really like the word vocation, because vocation is about a calling that it can change throughout life. I do not think we have to have one vocation, but the vocation is actually not about us. It's about the role that our soul is here to manifest out in the world. And that's what 10th house is all about. 11th house starts building into the collective. It's much more about the interconnections of the collective. It's about the way our own life is always concerned with the collective. Even if consciously we're like, I don't give a damn about the collective, we have a role to play in the collective. It's also our networks, our friendships. It's the way that we kind of, social media is a great literal dramatization of the energy of the 11th house, the way that there's all these connections, or the web, and things like the internet and the web do show up in 11th house archetypes. It's also the house of our own dreams and visions in this big way that's always connected to the collective, and the way that allowing ourselves to feel that we are our own evolution as part of humanity's evolution is also instilled in our dreams. This is all energy of the 11th house. Also, and in that respect, it can also be absolutely a house of service to a certain cause, whether that's a cause of justice or the way that we volunteer in certain organizations. But it's a house that, again, is transpersonal, going beyond my own self and connecting in some way with that which is much bigger. And also archetypally, the way that connection is ultimately about the evolution of humanity, whether we're connected to that consciously or unconsciously. And that brings us to our final house, which is the 12th house. The 12th house is the house of everything that is beyond the day-to-day categorizations of social living. It is the house that is ultimately the archetype of the 12th house. It is the ultimate transpersonal energy, because it is the complete dissolving of the ego and the return to source. It is, in that respect, the mystical experiences of oneness, whether that is oneness with the divine, oneness with God, oneness with an earth consciousness that just goes beyond everything that I am in my own sense of self. It is also often includes the parts of society that we being humans for hundreds and hundreds of years have excluded from the daily life. Like sometimes you'll hear about the way the prison systems are put into the 12th house. I think it's really important when we use that and look at that in no way is commenting on the identities that are excluded, other than to say that our society has failed because of power structures and has created these margins. And therefore, whatever shows up in the 12th house, I mean, the 12th house archetype is that of spiritual oneness. So it can also be the way that when we live marginalized in certain ways in our own identities, that we have much more wisdom than that which has been the marginalizing force, if that makes sense. That's when the 12th house is being read in terms of like the human structures and organizations of society that we are working on changing. But the ultimate meaning of the 12th house is ultimately going beyond the ego. And in this respect, the 12th house does, it has experiences of mystical oneness, blessedness. It also is the house in which addictions show up. The idea being that addictions and substances are often used to escape the ego. Often, especially if we're talking about addiction, it's escaping the pain. daily pain. I mean, that's often the nature of addiction. And especially if you have 12th house placements, I mean, the ultimate archetype of the energy is that we don't need substances, that we can align ourselves to a way of being in which the ego dissolves and we can experience that oneness with the divine. The 12th house also often has a push and pull of alienation because, I mean, we're talking about depths. And remember, I began this whole video, which is almost 40 minutes, by saying that like the energies just expand, and in that respect, the 12th house is like containing this potent potential of everything that came before. And that is just often a heck of a lot of energy. So it requires withdrawal from the day-to-day, withdrawing. I'm kind of thinking of the Hermit card right now in tarot in certain ways, because we have to withdraw in order to just be with the energy of the 12th house. The energy of the 12th house also often does not communicate in explicit language and rational constructions of meaning. It requires mediums like dream and art, nature, wilderness, poetry, all of these aesthetically mediated, other mediated ways of communicating, because again, it goes beyond the explicit structures of meaning making that we have created, especially the very kind of rational dominance that we've created in the past few hundred years. And then, what do you know? We move right back into the first house. So it's also really important to, even though when we go through the houses in this archetypal explanation like I've just done, it's not linear. Okay, it's linear when I explain it, and it's linear when we create this nice narrative. Okay, the soul starts in the first and it goes through the second. That's one way of looking at it. But just looking at the chart, we have all different parts of the psyche and all different placements, and there's all different timelines that we've been working with these energies. And then there's different, when we get advanced, there's different phases that the planets and the signs are speaking with each other. So we are in a very multidimensional sphere of embodiment when we're talking about the psyche and the chart. But when we are trying to just understand the basic archetypes, we use this 1 through 12 sphere, and it has a lot of meaning. And I don't think I have that many of you left with me after 40 minutes, but for those that are here, thank you for journeying with the Zodiac with me. And that's it. Bye-bye.